Hi, everyone. Welcome to this new EASD Academy webinar. I'm very happy with Katarina to be chairing it. And the topic of today is, as you know all, is tips and tricks to increase the chance of having article accepted. And for today, we are very happy to have a very nice guest, Hindrik Mulder, which is the editor-in-chief of Diabetologia. And he will present us a bit more his opinion and advice on this topic. And after that, we will have the floor for questions. So of course you can unmute and ask the question yourself, or you can also just write it in the chat and we can ask it for you. Both are okay. So I'm very happy to see that there is so many people joining, and I think it's because this topic is of very high interest for a lot of early career researchers. So I think we are all very excited to hear more about that. So Hindrik, you can start when you want.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll begin by sharing my screen. Okay. And can everybody see my first slide?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So first, I'd like to say that I'm delighted to have been invited to speak to you, the EASD Academy. I think the formation of the Academy is one of the more important things that the EASD has done in recent years. And in my view, you are the future of diabetes research. And I think it's really important for the community to support you and provide you with the best possible opportunities to develop your work. And I've been asked to speak about the journal Diabetologia, which is as you know, the journal of the EASD, and perhaps give you some tips and tricks to see whether that could increase the chances of your having articles accepted. Having said that, I think the journal is also looking to having the opportunity to work with you, perhaps not only as authors, but in the future also as reviewers and maybe ultimately as editors of the journal. And we're really trying to forge this relationship. I think the format and the procedures for that are being discussed. We don't have them in place yet, but I'm really looking forward to these interactions. Nevertheless, so tips and tricks, and I don't think all that I'm saying will be specifically relevant to Diabetologia. I think they are generalized concepts about scientific publishing. And I'm also hoping that it will form a basis for a discussion we can have later on. I think that will be more interesting than just having me ranting on about scientific publication. Nevertheless, let's see if I can get the presentation to work. So I have prepared a few topics that I'd like to speak to you about today. And I'll begin with presenting the scope of the Diabetologia for you. You probably already know this, but I think it's important to remind you about that. I'd also like to indicate that there is an ethical foundation of how Diabetologia works, the journal. I think it could be useful for you to see some metrics of the journal. And then we'll speak about the assessment criteria we have at the journal, because they form the basis for the recommendations and decisions about the manuscripts that are submitted to the journal. I will describe to you how the recommendations are made, which ultimately will take shape as decisions about manuscripts. I think it's worthwhile to speak a little bit about the cover letter, because these days a cover letter is more or less mandatory when you submit to any journal, and that also holds true for Diabetologia. And then I'll give you some advice on how to present your studies and making them attractive to Diabetologia or any journal for that matter. I think it's also useful to speak a little bit about how you should respond to reviewers' critique. And finally, in the unfortunate event that your manuscript has been rejected, it could be worthwhile thinking about whether you should appeal or not. I'm not saying that this should be the regular procedure, but sometimes even journals make mistakes, and that also occurs at Diabetologia, of course. Okay, so let's start. The scope of Diabetologia. So what I've basically done is I've taken a screen dump from our homepage, and this is, I think, the first page actually. And here it states very clearly that Diabetologia, or we, publish high-quality, cutting-edge articles on all aspects of diabetes, from basic science through translational work to clinical research. So the key word here is diabetes. There has to be a relevance for the disease for us to consider manuscripts submitted. But we don't restrict to any special type of research. So anything that's relevant to diabetes, be it basic, clinical, translational, genetic, epidemiology, we will consider anything that's useful for the community to see. Let's move on to ethics of publication. And this is really important because we are dealing with people who have spent a lot of time, effort, sometimes money, in order to prepare scientific work. And when we assess this, we must do this in a transparent as possible, but also fair way. And in order to do that, there are ethics that are in place for scientific publication. And I will not go through those in detail today. I'd just like to say that we do adhere to this at Diabetologia. And there are two really important bodies that have formulated these ethics. And one is the Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE. COPE is very much hands-on. They started out with generating codes of conduct when it comes to scientific publishing, but they've transitioned a little bit now into more an educational procedure. So they have lots of different pipelines for situations that can arise at a journal. And if you have some time to spend, I really encourage you to have a look at what's on the COPE webpage. It's actually quite useful. The other body that's relevant in this respect is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. They have produced a document. I think it's called the, let's see, I always forget which state it is, if it's the Minnesota or, yeah, whatever. It's named after a state in the US where there was a meeting and where there was a consensus of some fundamental aspects of scientific publishing. This relates a lot to who should be authors, etc. Again, I think it's very useful for you to have a look at these documents, particularly in the unfortunate event that there would be, say, a dispute that you are involved in when it comes to being authors or papers, etc. When assessing those types of problems, one relies on the principles that have been laid down by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. And we certainly pay attention to that when there are problems at Diabetologia. Okay, leaving the ethics behind, some metrics that relate to diabetologia. So this graph shows the number of submissions that we see annually. And they have been hovering around 2,000 manuscripts for quite a long time. There are slight variations. We had a peak in 2020, and now we're down again a little bit. The thinking is that the peak in 2020 was due to the fact that many people were not able to actually perform research actively. Instead, they were sitting at home in lockdown and having time to write up their manuscripts. And maybe some of the drop we are seeing in numbers now relate to the fact that things slowed down during the pandemic. But we don't know for sure. Another interesting way of looking at diabetologia is to see what is the country of origin of the submissions. And here we see a very clear trend, and that is that the submissions from China are increasing tremendously in number. So they now make up 25% or 26 actually, 26% of all the submissions we saw in 2022. And we are expecting this to increase. So what about acceptance rates and rejection at the journal? So in 2022, 79% of all manuscripts were more or less immediately rejected. This is what we call triage. And I was responsible for 70% of that, and the associate editors triaged another 9% of all the manuscripts. If we look over time, we see that the triage rate has increased. And this reflects the ambition that we have at Diabetologia to be a high-profile diabetes journal that publishes the best content in the field. So being selective. Sorry about that. Yes. So this is a strategy that we have so that we can achieve our goals and be this high-profile journal that we want. And this is not something that we have invented at the Diabetologia. This reflects the wishes of the association. So this is something that the EASD wants from its journal. So what happens to the rest of the manuscripts that are not triaged? Well, we send out about 20% of all the manuscripts for external peer review. And of those, about half are ultimately accepted. So we are now down to an acceptance rate around 10%, and consequently 90% of all manuscripts are rejected. So leaving that, and now instead thinking about what criteria do we apply at the journal to decide which manuscripts are taken further for external review and ultimately acceptance in the journal. And the first, these parameters, I've taken them from the web tool that the reviewers and the associate editors use when they report back their assessment of manuscripts. So the first question is about whether the research is novel, confirmatory, or controversial. This is then followed by questions that relate to presentation, and I'd say that this would reflect the overall quality of the manuscript. So is there a hypothesis that's clearly stated? Is the design adequate? Are the data in the manuscript adequate? Are the results conclusive? Do the results add new knowledge? Is the discussion well focused? Are the conclusions justified? If present, is supplementary material essential for the understanding of the manuscript? Next, we move to whether the manuscript is viewed as important. And here is I would say a scoring of the manuscript, which ranges from low level of importance to outstanding. And in a similar vein, which perhaps then is more related to the audience of Diabetologia, is it interesting at a high, medium, or low level? So all these parameters are scored by the reviewers and the associate editors. And finally, and importantly, there is also written feedback and critique for both the editors, but also for the authors. And this is what you will see if your paper has been brought forward to external peer review. You will not, obviously, you will not see the confidential comments to the editor, you will see the comments to the author. And the instruction to the reviewers is that in the comments to the author, they should not express any views on whether a manuscript should be accepted or not. It should only contain the hopefully constructive criticism that the reviewer has gathered during the review process. In the box for the confidential comments to the editor, the reviewer or the associate editor will speak more explicitly about whether a manuscript deserves to be published in the journal or not. And I think it's important to remember when you receive back this feedback that you're not seeing all the views of the reviewers and the associate editors. And sometimes I know that sometimes appeals are made because some of these statements about acceptance or not are not shown in the feedback to the authors. And sometimes the authors feel that the feedback is mild or it's constructive and possible to address. I'm sure we can discuss this more later on. Okay, so all this information is then distilled down into a recommendation / decision about your manuscript. And on your screen is now basically the boxes that are ticked by the reviewers and the associate editors. And it ranges from accept to decline in various different ways. And I don't know whether I should say something about the difference between minor revision and major revision. Clearly, it's quantitative in some sense that if a manuscript needs a lot of attention to be suitable for publication, then it's probably going to receive the decision major revision. And that would typically involve additional experiments, additional data to the manuscript. If it's a clinical study, you may have to extend the cohorts or add cohorts to your study in order for it to become more, that it's clear that your results can be replicated. In the case of minor revision, it may be sufficient to editorially revise the manuscript, meaning that you can clarify, add sentences, statements to your manuscript so that it becomes clearer to the reader. In this decision back to you, it will not say whether it's minor or major revision, but I still think it's possible to glean this from the decision letter, whether you have received a minor or major revision decision. We also have a category called reject with invitation to resubmit. And the papers that end up in this category are papers where we feel that it's probably possible to revise, but it would require a major effort to do that. And in order to be fair to the authors, they need to understand that this is really a major undertaking, and that we also understand that it will probably take some time. And in that case, it's better to reject, but provide an invitation to resubmit, provided that the authors are willing to spend the time and make the effort to revise the paper. Okay, manuscript transfer service is more, it's more a technical thing where our publisher wants us to forward papers to journals that our publisher also runs, so that content can be kept within the publishing house. So in the event that your manuscript is offered manuscript transfer service, a list will appear in your decision letter with links to journals that could be potential journals for you to publish in. Okay, so let's move on to tips and tricks. And for this purpose, I'd really like to direct you to the page on our home page for authors and reviewers. And if you scroll down on this page, one of my predecessors, Edwin Gale, which I think he was one of the great editors of the journal, and probably the one who formed it into what we have today. He put down a checklist, and it's actually for reviewers. But I think even as an author, if you read through this list and think about what he states there, it's also relevant for you, because if you can so to speak tick these boxes, you probably have a manuscript which is really, really good and deserves publication in a really, really nice journal. So have a look at this. So in terms of the fundamental parameters when thinking about whether a manuscript should be accepted or not, I think there are three parameters that are important, and I wouldn't say that they are important in any particular order or that there's a hierarchy, but for the manuscripts that we consider for Diabetologia, we want to see novelty, we want to see relevance and quality. I think quality is a given. We can never accept low quality in the papers, even if they are super novel or highly relevant. Novelty is, of course, very good for the journal in terms of raising interest for novel topics, but something that's not novel can still be published if there's a very high level of quality and if it's very relevant for the journal. At the same time, something that's very novel and has high quality but is not relevant to the journal will not be considered. So these different parameters are sort of, they are merged and ultimately result in what I call a priority score. This is not a number, but it's It's an overall assessment of the manuscripts. And if you receive a high priority, that's when your manuscripts are taken further for external review and hopefully eventually being accepted in the journal. Okay, so thinking about these fundamental issues, hypotheses are really, really important. So in your work, are you addressing a hypothesis? This may sound self-evident, but I can tell you, we see so many manuscripts where there's actually no hypothesis. We don't understand why the work has been done. So think about this when you formulate your research questions. What is the hypothesis? Can it be proven or disproven? And I think it's really important that this is super clear from a manuscript. Otherwise, you are on thin ice. It's really important to think about whether your work is mechanistic or descriptive. I think it's, again, self-evident that if work is mechanistic, it will lead to deeper understanding. But all work cannot be mechanistic. Descriptive work can also be very, very useful. But in terms of scoring for a journal, mechanistic work will generate a higher score. Causal versus correlative, I think it's of the same nature as mechanistic versus descriptive. That if you can produce data that show causality, that's really, really important, whereas correlative data are less useful. But again, everything cannot be causal in terms of scientific data. When you think about the design of your study, is it convincing to the reader that your methods, the models that you use, the cohorts that you analyze, your analysis overall, that they appropriately address your research question? If all of this is appropriate, then it's also highly likely that you have a manuscript of very high quality. Novelty, again, this is a very important aspect of the work. Clearly, original work rates higher than confirmatory work. But if a topic is really important, it's also important to confirm. So it doesn't mean that you cannot publish if it's confirmatory. It depends on the importance of your research topic. Relevance. For diabetologia, this is very important. Your work needs to be relevant for diabetes. We see lots of manuscripts that address obesity-related mechanisms, sometimes cardiovascular questions. And we always ask ourselves, is this work relevant for diabetes or not? And some of these manuscripts are triaged because we don't feel that they are within the remit of the journal. Okay, so cover letter. This is the first instance where you present your work to the editors of the journal, or actually mostly to me. And we prepared a little Ask Me Anything session that you can find on Diabetologia's YouTube channel. And yes, I read every cover letter for every manuscript. So how should you effectively write a cover letter? Well, I think it's important to be brief. So please be to the point. Your tone, I think, should be assured, but you should not be exaggerating. Don't overstate your results or the importance or novelty of what you're addressing. Think about Diabetologia's scope. Is your paper within the journal's remit? The topic, is your research question timely and important burning? Novelty, is your research novel or an extension of what you and others have published previously? And in this respect, be honest, because we will we will see through whether there is previous publications. We will find that. And again, confirmation can be important. So it's not that you're doing yourself a disservice by indicating this. High quality. Don't say that your work is of high quality. This should be evident from your description of the cohorts, the models, the methodology that you have been using, how your work is rigorous, that there is replication, that is clinically relevant. All of these aspects of your work assures that it's of high quality. See here, I can't advance this. Okay. It's also comme il faut in a cover letter to state that your work has not been previously published, that it's an exclusive submission to this particular journal, and that the work has been approved by all authors. If these issues are not in order, you will have problems with your submission down the line. There can be automatic rejection, and in the worst case scenario, there can be ethical repercussions where there will be complaints filed to your home institution, etc. And the journal is actually very, very good at discovering these types of misconduct. It's not common, but we have a few cases that are ongoing more or less all the time, and we're getting better and better at identify these types of misconduct. Okay, so let's be a little bit more specific before we end. So what do we expect from manuscripts in basic science? Well, first of all, I want to make it very clear that the journal encourages and accepts basic science studies. However, there needs to be some relevance for diabetes. In terms of mechanisms versus descriptive data, if your work is mechanistic, you will receive a higher score for your manuscript. But it doesn't mean that descriptive work is of no use or interest, but you have to be prepared that your manuscript will receive lower scores. Cell lines versus primary cells. I would say at this point, it's highly unlikely that you would have a manuscript published or even reviewed if the work is only done in cell lines. I think the exception to this would be that you're studying something that's extremely important and very, very novel, and that it's not possible to study it in any other way. But replicating your work from cell lines in primary cells is a good way of increasing the validity of your work, and it will generate higher scores. The same holds true for cell lines versus animal study. If you can provide this type of translation, your work will generate a higher score. Silencing, or it's very, very common today that there is genetic manipulation in basic science studies. And think about whether you could elevate your work by performing both silencing knockout studies and overexpression. Sometimes this is not possible, but you will lend a much greater level of validity to your work if you can show both sides of the coin. When you're performing animal studies, think about whether your manipulation is whole body versus cell or tissue specific. Is it permanent, or is it inducible, temporal? all these different aspects of these types of manipulations are important to consider when we're looking at the priority of the manuscripts. Animal studies versus human studies. Again, translation generates higher scores. You will provide much more relevance to your basic science work if you, in some way, can validate your findings in human material. It doesn't mean that you have to perform a human study, but there are ways of confirming your results, at least partially, in human material. When you consider the design, it's important to have sufficient numbers, that there's statistical rigor. When you're performing animal work, make sure that you replicate your work in several groups of animals. Doing it just once at one particular time point is not very impressive. Okay, let's move to clinical science. Work can be retrospective, cross-sectional, or prospective. And clearly, prospective studies rate higher than retrospective studies. Again, this is not always possible to achieve, but this is something that is part of the assessment of the manuscripts. When looking at, say, drug effects, randomization and a controlled trial rates much higher than open trials where there's no randomization. These studies can even be double-blinded, that can be crossover. So there are many ways of really increasing the rigor of your work. And that will reflect on the priority that your manuscripts will receive. Diabetologia encourages what we call, or well, not we, but what's known as investigator-initiated studies. So I have a soft spot for these types of studies. I'm sure there are many definitions of what an IIS is, but in many cases, these are studies that are addressing a novel hypothesis, and they are not backed by a large pharmaceutical company. They are typically smaller studies, but when they are at their best, they are very detailed and provides interesting new concepts that can be worked on in many different circumstances. So these are well liked at Diabetologia. Think about the power when you're designing your study, so you actually can show differences between groups. Again, statistical rigor, use the analysis and tests that are accepted in the field. Replication is very important in clinical science. Are your results specific for an ethnic group or a sex or an age group? All of these issues need to be thought about when you're presenting your results. And ideally, you have addressed this scientifically. Epidemiology and genetics. It's very important for these studies that there are ethical permissions, that when necessary, they are registered in databases, and that data are made available for the scientific community. Again, is the research question relevant? This may also sound self-evident, but I can tell you, we see so many papers today on research questions which probably are not relevant. There are so many databases and registries where you can combine different sorts of data, which can generate significant results. But is it interesting and is it relevant? In many cases, not. Okay, is the work original or a replication of previous observations? Important to think about. Again, retrospective, cross-sectional, or prospective. Replication is important so that you use more than one cohort. that you consider the impact of ethnicity, sex, and age. Functional validation is very important in genetics study. So lists of genetic loci or metabolites are descriptive research and do not score very high at the journal. Again, statistical rigor, very important. Think about whether that could be confounding of data in your analysis. Causality, important to reach that if possible, or are your data merely correlative? In epidemiology, it's possible to perform Mendelian randomization, which provides some level of causality to the data. Finally, helicopter research is discouraged at the journal. So if analysis studies are done in, say, parts of the world where there are less resources, I think it's really important to involve scientists locally in order to spread scientific methodology and make sure that the people who have collected the data are acknowledged properly. Finally, systematic reviews and meta-analysis. Diabetologia will consider these types of manuscripts, but there needs to be a clear relevance for diabetes. I would still say that Diabetologia prioritizes original studies, i.e. the studies that make up the systematic reviews and the meta-analysis. We also like to see authors with field competence as authors of these types of manuscripts. So systematic reviews and meta-analysis will be considered when they are appropriate and useful, in the sense that novel information is generated. Merely updating previous systematic reviews doesn't create much enthusiasm at the journal. Finally, just a few words about how you should handle reviewers' critique. A point-by-point response is the most helpful and effective way to address the critique by reviewers. Respond to all points raised. This doesn't mean that you need to perform all the experiments that have been requested or add all the data, but you have to explain why you have deferred to amend your study. And in many cases, this will be accepted if you have a good explanation. Finally, appeal of editorial decisions. If you consider this, begin with a brief and focused note to the editor-in-chief. Explain why you think the decision was incorrect and should be changed. And please also remember that prioritization is a major determinant of the editorial decision. So robust and high quality studies will be rejected when novelty and interest to Diabetologia's wide audience are insufficient. In most cases, the editor-in-chief will consult with the handling associate editor, and there can be two outcomes. The decision will stand, or the editors will reconsider, and you will be invited to submit a rebuttal and or revise your manuscript. So I think this was my last slide, and thank you for allowing me to speak to you. And I'm very happy to start a discussion about these issues. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Hindrik. I have to say you already answered to some of the questions I had, especially I always wonder if the cover letter was actually read. It was a bit of a black box. I think I just had to copy paste my abstract, and I think I was not doing it properly. So it's very nice to know that. I think we will open for questions. So I think everyone, you can use the reaction button maybe to raise your hand and ask your question, or you can just write it in the chat, as Katarina said. Yeah, I can see one question already. Sandra?
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting presentation. I had a question about this transfer, because I always wonder, if you get the offer that your paper is transferred to another journal, is it really because the editors think it's really interesting for that journal, or is it more done because they are asked to do that?
I'd say it's both. We would not suggest a manuscript transfer if we don't think that the work is robust and interesting. So that is a given. But you're also right in the sense that our publisher asks us to do this. There is I would say, a special case of manuscript transfer, which is called cascading. And that's between journals that are topically related. I would say that the typical example is the Cell Press journals. So if your paper is rejected at Cell, maybe they will offer you a transfer to, say, Cell Metabolism. And in that case, your manuscript with the reviewer comments will go to the editor-in-chief of the next level journal, and then they will discuss whether that manuscript is suitable for the journal or not.
Okay, thank you.
There is another raised hand. Haifa, unmute yourself.
Yes. Hello. Thank you for this informative talk. My question is about the selection of reviewers. How the methodology select reviewers? Do you have a database of like names in different, like basic scientist, epidemiologist? How do you do this selection?
I'd say the most important mechanism is that the associate editors, they have a network of people that they know within their area of expertise. So they will ask people whom they know are knowledgeable within that particular field. In addition, the web tool that we're using, Scholar One, has a database with keywords. So you can identify people who fit sort of a topic description. I'm not sure that's the best way to find reviewers. I think many of the associate editors will also look at the reference list in the manuscript and try to identify people who are working in the same area, maybe on the same problem, and invite them to review. Many of you also suggest reviewers for your papers, and we will, in many cases, consider those names. Sometimes you ask us not to recruit certain reviewers, and we will most often respect that. In some cases, maybe the associate editor thinks that there is not a conflict of interest, and we'll still seek advice from a person in that category, but of course keeping in mind that the authors have been a bit hesitant about that person. So it's all up to the judgment of the associate editor to choose the best possible reviewers.
I have a question which relates to this, because as you mentioned, we, the EASD Academy, are working with the Methodology to bring new young reviewers to the Methodology. So why do you think it would be useful for early career researchers serving as a reviewer for the Methodology or for other journals?
Well, for many reasons. First, I think being a reviewer is part of being an academic scientist. This is something you need to master. I think it's useful for you to see what's going on in your area of research, because you will be asked to review papers that are within your area of expertise. I think it could actually boost your self-confidence, to see papers sort of in the process of becoming accepted papers eventually. You will probably notice that everything is not as good as you thought. You will see some very bad examples when you review, and maybe that will make you more confident that what you're doing yourselves is actually very good. And don't, yeah. So I think it's very useful to do this. Absolutely.
Thanks. So I think, yeah, don't hesitate to raise your hand if you have a question. In the meantime, I actually have one.
Mm-hmm.
You could see that most papers are rejected as triage from the editor, right?
Yes.
So say you're reading the cover letter, but is there something else we can do to catch your interest as an editor? Is it something in the paper, you know, is it the format, the fancy method? Is it a graphical abstract? Is there something that will like really, yeah, catch your interest into looking more into the paper?
Well, the first thing I read is, well, obviously it's the title of the paper to get some orientation. I always look at the authors, and the reason that I do that is that if there is somebody I've been working with, and if I have a conflict of interest, then I recuse myself, and we have another editor that steps in and handles the paper. We are not supposed to pay any attention to whom the authors are for any other reason. This is one of the ethical principles of I think, fair scientific publication. So the next thing that I will read is the cover letter. And you mentioned, I think, the abstract. I don't think it's a good procedure to copy the abstract into the cover letter. I think you need to distill what's original about your paper. Why do you think it's a good fit for Diabetologia? And that's a combination of relevance, quality, and novelty. So you need to indicate this in a few sentences, and if that keeps me interested, and it does in most cases, I will go on and I will read the abstract. And there, of course, you need to write an effective abstract. We have loosened a bit, so we don't require the abstract to be formatted according to Diabetologia, the specifications that we have. And the reason is that we triage a lot of the papers, so we don't want the authors to sort of to spend efforts on something that's not useful for them. So I'll read the abstract, even though it's not formatted for Diabetologia. It's not a minus in my book.
Okay, that's nice to hear. Sandra, maybe you had the question? Or?
Yeah, well, it was already answered, I think. So, but I can ask another question out of curiosity. Is it really happening that people submit papers that like at multiple journals at the same time, or?
I think this happens quite a lot. It's difficult for us to find those manuscripts, but redundant publication is something we do find. So we have a tool that basically trawls the internet. So we will find papers that are similar to what has been submitted to the journal. So everything that's submitted to the journal and that goes through peer review is assessed by this web tool.
Yeah, okay. I think that Haifa had a second question, but just before. But submitting in bioRxiv is not an issue, right? Do you have to say it because you will find it?
No, actually, we encourage that. So,
okay.
So we think that is a plus, and we have a mechanism in place now for direct submission from bioRxiv and medRxiv.
Okay, great. Yeah, Haifa.
I'm curious to know what was the main factor that increased the impact factor of Diabetologia during 2022? Is it like specific papers, or what kind of, like, if you assess that?
Mm. I mean, this is the million-dollar question. If I knew exactly what it was that determined this rise in impact factor, we would go for that and try to take advantage of that. There is one circumstance, though, and that is the first time the impact factor rose above 10 was actually a technical issue, because in 2021, when the impact factor was calculated, Clarivate, the company that does this, included manuscripts from the date of web publication, but those were not included in the numerator, which means that mathematically there was an inflation of the impact factor. And this is something that basically happened to all journals. So I would say that most journals increased their impact factor by maybe 15 or 20%. So we went from, I forget, maybe 7.5 to 10 or something like that. So we were expecting a downturn in 2022, but we continued to rise. And that's not a technical issue. That's a real increase. And exactly what determines that, like I said, if I knew, I would, we would focus on that. But the strategy that we have is that we are very selective. Clearly this can be a bit of a dilemma, because if we are too selective, this may discourage people from submitting to the journal. So we are a little bit concerned about the fact that the number of submissions is going down, but we still think it is a post-pandemic issue. But we'll know more this year, so we'll see how this continues.
I think maybe Pierre Larofi had a question. I've seen your hand raised before.
In reality, you already asked it, because I was going to ask about bioarchive and submission.
Okay, that's great. So if there is another question, otherwise I was actually wondering about something, because in your presentation you were talking about priority and relevance, and you talked about is it a hot topic? Is it timely research and burning questions? So maybe you can tell us more about what is a hot topic right now for diabetology? What is the burning question you want to answer and publish in your journal?
So I think I don't really want to answer that question, to be honest. I think that the community should determine this, what's hot. I don't think that the journal should influence this. I want this to be organic, coming from the community. Having said that, of course, we are aware of areas which are hot and burning, so to speak. And one way that we deal with that is that we prepare these special issues on these topics. So last year, the special issue was on precision medicine. This year's special issue will be on incretins. And obviously, we would not prepare these special issues because it's a major effort for the journal if we didn't think it was important for the field.
Thanks for this very honest answer. Yeah, I don't know if we have more in the audience. We are running a bit over time, but I guess we can take something extra question. Someone...
May I ask something? So if your paper is rejected, so what's your strategy? Should you aim for something, I don't know, a higher ranked journal or something lower? You downgrade, what's your strategy?
Well, it depends on why it was rejected. And I try to give a little indication on why. Not any extensive feedback, but maybe a sentence or two or three, so that the authors can receive some guidance. One circumstance would be that we feel that the manuscript is too specialized for the journal. But there are journals that are very specialized and that have a higher impact factor than Diabetologia. So I would envision that a paper of a very high quality that we thought was too specialized for the journal could go to such a journal instead. We've run some analysis on this a couple of years back, and we saw that most of the papers that were rejected from Diabetologia, or probably most, were eventually published somewhere, and I'd say like in perhaps 97% of cases in lower tier journals. We have preliminary data from the last years, and what we're seeing is that a somewhat higher proportion of the triaged papers are going into journals with a similar impact factor, or even a higher impact factor. And that's a consequence of the selectivity. Clearly we are just humans, and maybe sometimes we make mistakes, or I think it's quite likely we make mistakes. So some manuscripts that could have been excellent for Diabetologia are rejected. But that's a consequence of the selectivity, and we are still, at least at the time being, continuing with this selectivity in order to raise the profile of the journal.
Thanks a lot for this answer, and thanks a lot for your participation to this webinar. I think it was very informative for me, and I'm sure for all of us that joined. And so thanks a lot for joining us. I just want to remind everyone here that the EASD Academy is actually calling for new committee members. So if you're interested into helping us and join to develop our activity, I will encourage you to just have a quick look at the website and to apply, because you can still send your application right now. And maybe, Katarina, you want to say something about the mentorship?
Yes, of course. We have just launched the mentorship program of the EASD Academy, so it's also on our website. And this will allow early career researchers to meet with mentors, and they will be matched, and they will be helped by their mentors to grow their knowledge and their skills and network in the diabetes field. So please check our website for these opportunities, both joining us as a committee member and participating in the mentorship program.
Perfect. Thanks to everyone that joined. Thanks, again, Hindrik, and have a good evening, everyone.
Thanks for having me.